Okay, very good. So good morning, everybody. My name is Julie Ansis. I'm the founding director of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism. Welcome to our speaker series. The overarching mission and aim of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism is to address anti-Semitism as relates to the field of psychology and foster Jewish-affirming training, education, research, and practice. We are comprised of over 340 psychologists and other mental health professionals, including faculty, clinicians, and administrators. If you wish to learn more about Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism and join us, what I'm going to do is put the website address in the chat. All you need to do is complete the form in the link at the bottom of the homepage, and you will be added to our email list. So now for today's event, I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rusi Jaspal. Dr. Jaspal will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and we will then open the floor to question and answer. Mics are currently muted to avoid disruptions. If you wish to speak after Dr. Jaspal speaks, please just click on the reactions tab on your screen and tap raise hands, and I will unmute you. So to introduce Dr. Jaspal is Pro Vice-Chancellor, Research and Knowledge Exchange, and a professor of psychology at the University of Brighton in the United Kingdom. Much of his research has focused on the social psychological aspects of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, especially in Muslim societies. He is the author of the book Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism, Representation, Cognition, and Everyday Talk, published by Taylor and Francis in 2020. His most recent article in this area is entitled The Social Psychology of Anti-Semitism, published in Israel Affairs. The title of his talk today is The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, Social Psychological Perspectives. Dr. Jaspal, I'm honored and really thrilled to have you here with us today. So welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for the invitation and for the introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here to be able to give this talk. It's a topic that's very close to my heart. And thank you very much for those who are joining us, those of you who are joining us to listen to my lecture. I'm going to say just a few words about why I'm interested in this particular area of research, because although I have done quite a bit of work in this area, my principal research area is actually health psychology, and particularly around how we can get people to change their behaviors to promote healthy health outcomes, positive health outcomes. So it can seem rather distant from that area. This focus on anti-Semitism. But what I've always believed is that we need to use the tools that we have in our research to address really pressing problems. And I see anti-Semitism as a problem that remains. It's an age-old form of prejudice, and it's changed a great deal over time. And so I think that there are theories of identity can help us to better understand this and hopefully inform policy, practice, and basically promote better outcomes, societal outcomes, by eradicating this form of prejudice. So I'll talk about some of the key constructs that I'm interested in, and about which there's much debate. There's often a lack of consensus about what they mean. I'll then outline key theories that I'll be drawing upon, and then my two case studies. I, as Julie has mentioned, have done quite a bit of work on anti-Semitism in Muslim societies in particular. And these are two particular groups that I focused on in the research that I've done. I will also talk about different levels of analysis as well, because it's quite unusual for psychologists to examine things like discourse and media representation. But I see that also as being quite an important part of understanding why anti-Semitism might arise and why it's sustained in particular societal contexts. I'll talk about attitudes as well as gauged through surveys, quantitative surveys, as well as qualitative interview research. And then I'll wrap up with some reflections You'll note that my slides are quite long, and they're deliberately quite long because I'd also like to make them available to colleagues who are interested in this, in discovering more about this area of work, but I will try and keep my presentation to 30 minutes. And Julie, please feel free to intervene if you feel that I'm going over time. Okay, so first of all, some key concepts. Anti-Semitism has been defined as a persistent, latent structure of hostile beliefs towards Jews. And I think that this is a really useful definition because anti-Semitism can be manifested at the level of belief and cognition. It can also be manifested in behaviorally, and we refer to that often as being discrimination. And there can be quite subtle forms of anti-Semitism as well. I feel that this definition captures all of that. Sometimes we use definitions that are very, very specific and that don't actually effectively capture the full breadth of the problem that we're looking at. And that's why I like this definition. Anti-Zionism is a bit more tricky to define, and there's a lot of debate about what is and what isn't anti-Zionism, and indeed the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I refer to this, and I came up with this, this definition because I was dissatisfied with many others that existed already. But I define it as the denigration and the delegitimization of the state of Israel. And it's often linked to the political left. It's often also linked to notions of anti-colonialism, the implication being that Israel is a colonial society, and to emancipation. It's often linked to, you know, this idea that to be anti-Zionist means that you are really in support of emancipation. And some people therefore are quite proud to lay claim to an anti-Zionist identity, or they claim very openly to be anti-Zionist. Criticism of the Israeli government, in my view, is not anti-Zionism per se, and I always say that in the same breath as lamenting anti-Zionism itself. I think it's very important because we should be able to level criticism against any government and any political party, for that matter, and without fear of being referred to as being anti-Zionist. But I think the key point is that often criticism of the state of Israel, criticism of the Israeli government, does descend into delegitimization of the state, which I define as being anti-Zionism. So anti-Zionism sometimes is poorly, I think anti-Zionism is poorly understood, and it's referred to in a wide range of ways because Zionism itself is poorly understood. And I think that a key mission that we have as psychologists against anti-Semitism is also to challenge erroneous representations of Zionism itself. In my view also, I think anti-Zionism, defined in the way in which I define it, amounts to anti-Semitism. I've yet to hear a convincing argument as to why there should be a focus on the one and only Jewish state when people are, delegitimizing the state of Israel. Why the focus on the state, and why the focus upon, or the challenging of, Jewish nationhood? And the answer that I arrive at, the conclusion that I arrive at very frequently when I study anti-Zionism, is that this does amount, therefore, to anti-Semitism. Just to say a few words very briefly about some previous work on anti-Semitism that's inspired me. I'll point to some examples now, and then I'll move on to talk about my own work. But it's been observed by eminent colleagues in this area, such as Rosenfeld, that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have become quite radical, they've become quite widespread, and also that the two have become very explicitly conflated. And what I mean by that is often anti-Semitic tropes, classic anti-Semitic tropes, are used to substantiate an anti-Zionist position. He also notes that a key feature in contemporary anti-Zionism is the distortion of Holocaust memory and meaning as a means of delegitimizing the state of Israel and the reasons purported for its establishment in the first place. Anti-Semitism is also manifested in so many different ways, and we talk about, for instance, European anti-Semitism. We talk about left-wing anti-Semitism. And in my own work, I've talked a great deal about Islamist anti-Semitism. Now, there is a unifying thread across all of those forms of anti-Semitism, all of those manifestations. But sometimes by delineating them in this way, we are able to look at the very specific underpinnings within these different contexts, and indeed the implications of particular forms of anti-Semitism as expressed in particular contexts. Colleagues such as Gunter Ukeli have looked also at how young Muslims attempt to rationalize their negative views of Jews in Israel and then link them to geopolitical events, again shedding light on the link between more classic forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I've been quite inspired also by the work of Florette Cohen, who's looked at modern anti-Semitism, but through the theoretical lens of terror management theory. And terror management theory is a rather interesting, unusual theory, which basically has shown in numerous contexts that when people think about their own mortality, when they are primed to think about their own mortality, they tend to discriminate against outgroups. Given that anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice, it could therefore be hypothesized that someone whose mortality is salient is manifesting prejudice towards all outgroups, regardless of the particular outgroup. That is not what Florette Cohen's research shows. It shows actually that levels of anti-Semitism are particularly higher than forms of other prejudice when one's mortality becomes salient in an American sample, in a US sample. So it shows that, again, that there is something specific about anti-Semitism that's worthy of study, that makes this worthy of study. And there's been some interesting research looking at superstitious beliefs and anti-Semitism, and I would also argue, therefore, that conspiracy theorizing is a very key component often of anti-Semitism, and also that culture is key because we draw upon our own culture to substantiate some of the positions that we have, the claims that we make, the stock of ideas that we have available to us within our culture. Now, very briefly, I'd like to just outline some theories from social psychology, because I see this as being one of the key sort of take-home messages from the talk that I think will be useful for those who are interested in this area. There are two theories in particular that I want to point to. The first is social representations theory, and that's the theory that argues that we are constantly exposed to different versions of reality, and it outlines how we come to make sense of novelty in our contexts, how we come to append meaning to novelty, and how we give it a sort of a tangible existence beyond the abstract reality that we perhaps encounter when people mention something new. The theory argues that there are two key processes through which we develop what we call a social representation or a version of reality. And the first is anchoring. We link something new to things that we already know about. And the second is objectification. We try and make abstract phenomena tangible images, particularly through metaphor, personification, through the use of visual images. And if we link the theory to Israel and also to Jews and the way in which Jews in Israel are represented, we often find, for example, that in anti-Semitic discourse, Jews may be, if we think about how, in particular, Palestinians are represented in order to form a particular social representation of the state of Israel, Palestinians may be anchored to or linked to the experience of Jews during the Holocaust, the idea being that they are facing the same reality, and that this time the perpetrators of those injustices are Jews stroke Israelis. So that's one way in which anchoring can be used to further substantiate a particular image of Jews. If we think also about objectification, there are various metaphors that can be used, again, around the Holocaust, around Nazi ideology to describe Jews and or Israel. And so this is a very powerful and useful theory because it can enable us to identify seemingly quite subtle forms of prejudice as well, particularly in the media, where they may be ignored or not really taken seriously as examples of anti-Semitism. So the theory really allows us to do just that, to identify that. The second theory that I think is quite important is intergroup threat theory. And the idea is that we may be told or come to believe that our valued in-group, our group memberships are somehow challenged by mysterious outgroups. And threats can operate at different levels. They can be so-called realistic threats, which are all about physical harm or economic harm to one's in-group, or they can be more symbolic threats, such as harm to one's cultural norms and values, or harm in political context. Now, it's very easy to see how over history, over time, Jews have been represented as posing both realistic and symbolic threats in a variety of different contexts in different ways. And that those threats have then been used to sometimes mobilize people to behave in very hostile and aggressive ways. And we've seen that, of course, the most evident example of that is the Nazi Holocaust, where Jews were consistently being represented as being a threat. We subsequently see that with Israel being represented as posing a threat. A theory that I've developed over the last few years is the theory, identity process theory. And that is a theory that is about individuals. It's about how individuals seek feelings of self-esteem, continuity over time in the face of change, positive distinctiveness vis-a-vis others, including other groups, and a sense of control competence, which we refer to as self-efficacy. And the key point is that sometimes social representations and group level threats, in the way I described, can curtail these feelings. It can make people feel that they have less self-esteem, that they have, they're no longer distinctive, and that they no longer have control and competence, particularly when an out-group is positioned as being quite strong and powerful, as Jews are according to anti-Semitic tropes. When the theory argues, when we face threat, we, as a result of those principles being challenged, we will try to cope and we will try to restore levels of those principles. One way in which we cope is also to discriminate against other people. That can be a coping strategy. So think about, for instance, let me just give an example that's completely unrelated to anti-Semitism. When somebody is told something that challenges their self-esteem, they may behave towards that individual in a hostile manner, sometimes belittling them, denigrating them, delegitimizing what they have to say, and that protects their self-esteem, or at least transiently. We can see the very same process underway actually in relation to groups, because when groups feel that they are also challenged by an out-group, they can do just that. And discrimination is all about curtailing an individual's or self-esteem on the basis of their group membership. They may delegitimize, they may engage in conflict. The us versus them mentality becomes mobilized and can become sustained over time, particularly when the media also helps to do that. And I believe that that's what lies at the heart of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and it requires further study. Now, coming to my own research in the time that I have left, I'd like to just say a little bit about Iranian anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which constitute, which is actually quite a strong and powerful, insidious form of anti-Semitism in the world, which is also a state ideology. It's indeed a building block of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the revolution in 1979, Iran's clerics and politicians have denounced Israel. They've questioned its legitimacy as a state, and they've repeatedly also called for its destruction. They very consistently interchangeably use Jew and Zionist in their political discourse. And I think what's unique also about Iran is its demographic reality. It's the country with the largest Jewish population in outside of Israel within the region. So it's, you know, also a country with a significant Jewish population who have been referred to as being held hostage in many respects, particularly when there is conflict or potential for conflict with other countries, most notably with the United States. And I've also looked, as I mentioned, at anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism in a very different Muslim context, and that is British Pakistani Muslims, so those living in the UK as particularly second and third generation Muslims. And that's on the basis of research showing that vis-a-vis other groups within the UK population, this particular group does tend to score higher on scales of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Just to contextualize, British Pakistanis constitute a large proportion of the ethnic minority population in the UK, and they're located in large cities such as London, Birmingham, and Bradford, with smaller communities elsewhere within the country. But they're the main centres where there are large, relatively close-knit communities of British Pakistanis. It's been noted that that Muslim suffering and grievances elsewhere can be deeply felt by Muslims in the UK, many of whom may feel quite disenfranchised and ostracized from the rest of society due to prejudice they experience themselves through Islamophobia and particularly post 9/11 and post July 7th bombings in London, where Islamophobia has increased a great deal, and where there can be also a mistrust of institutions in the UK, as well as the media, and therefore a reliance upon alternative sources of information around politics. And that can include, as I will outline a little bit later on in a few moments, Iranian media outlets, which are seen by some as being a more faithful, real exposition of politics in the region as opposed to Western media. So on that note, I'd like to say a little bit about this particular set of studies I did on social representations of Israel and Jews in the Iranian media. And I analysed two outlets, the Tehran Times and Press TV, looking at their reporting. And this was conducted, well, actually a decade ago now. It feels strange, actually, over a decade ago. But I think much of this remains relevant at the moment, perhaps even more relevant now. In the systematic qualitative analysis that I did, I found three themes. There was a consistent resistance of social representations of Israeli statehood, and often terms like the Zionist regime, the Tel Aviv regime, the Hebrew regime, occupied Palestine were used to describe it. But also in just thinking back to social representations theory, there were metaphors of health and particularly disease that were used in order to describe Israel. And of course, you can see here the reference in the second quote to metastasis in relation to cancer as well. So this, again, motivating people not only to think about Israel, not as a state, but as some sort of rogue regime, but also one that requires intervention in order for it to stop spreading, like a cancer would. In the second theme, just really following on from what I just said, there was a very clear construction of an outgroup threat. And not only a threat in the way that, in the quite abstract way that's been described, but also as a threat to Iranian scientists and to Iranians themselves. So, promoting this view that Zionists can strike at any point, in any context. So really fear-mongering a great deal within society and elsewhere, and also linking the regime to terrorism, capitalizing on existing discourses around terrorism that were around at that time and that remain around, but linking terrorism to the state of Israel or the Israeli regime as being the reason that this actually exists, referring also to Israel and the US as the axis of terrorism in the world. And I think on the basis of these two themes, one of the most important ones is really the responses that are outlined or that are offered, the possible mitigation actions that can be offered in order to reduce the perceived threat. And the key one was the construction of anti-Zionism as being a religious duty for the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim communities across the world. And so these quotes illustrate that, the idea of the liberation of Palestine being a unifying point of Islamic awakening movement, so something that can unify Muslims around the world, and also the representation of Palestine as being the main issue of the Islamic world, and constructing Israel in particular as the enemy alongside the United States, the enemy the common enemy of all Muslims. Now, if you think back to what I said a moment ago about the reliance of some disenfranchised young Muslims upon Iranian media, we can see how the messages that are the representations that are being disseminated are not just being disseminated within Iran, but elsewhere as well. There is a desire here to influence thinking within the Muslim world. I also did an analysis, again, as part of the social representations work, of a particular competition that took place in Iran, and that was the Holocaust cartoons competition, which received a great deal of press coverage. Was almost represented in the Islamic world as being a marker of Iranian pride for actually standing up to Israel. This was the idea that was being promoted. So it was a competition that took place. People around the world were invited to submit cartoons representing the Holocaust. The idea being that the Holocaust is a myth and that it never took place, or it didn't take place in the way in which it is historically being claimed. That was the underpinning idea, and people were rewarded. There were prizes were given to the best depictions of Holocaust denial in a nutshell. I wanted to look at these images and to look at some of the representations that they seem to be promoting in particular, to try and gauge how people might be thinking and come to think on the basis of these very well publicized cartoons that really came from across the world, including Latin America, for instance. It wasn't exclusively from within the Islamic world or the Middle East. There were cartoons from all over the world. You could look at the paper and there's actually a breakdown of where the cartoons came from. And the three themes that come across, which I think are sort of exemplified by some of those I reproduced here for you, just to give you a flavor of some of the cartoons that were submitted. The key themes were that there was a construction of Jewish people as being evil and Israel as being brutal, and the two were often conflated. And we can see that, for instance, in the first cartoon that's displayed here, with a depiction of somebody who is visibly Jewish, but also there is a link there to Israel politics, and particularly to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. There was systematic, as you'd expect, denial of the Holocaust, but what was quite key was that when the Holocaust was being denied, there was an affirmation of Palestinian suffering. So, for instance, some cartoons represented Palestinians in a Holocaust camp, in a concentration camp uniform, for instance. And we can also see here how in the second cartoon that's in the middle here, how the Holocaust is essentially being denied because the individual is creating that with a smirk on their face, but also how the world is being silenced in the face of this constructed injustice. And third, there was a theme around international subservience to so-called Nazi Zionist ideology. This idea being that people need to mobilize, and this was being linked to the Islamic awakening movements that they refer to, which is basically the Arab Spring, which is what they refer to as the Arab Spring. So against that backdrop, that's the backdrop against which people may be coming to think about Jews in Israel within these societies. And I just reiterate, it's beyond Iran, although Iran sees itself as being the sort of leader, the leading force behind anti-Zionism. But these are representations intended for a much broader, wider readership audience. Beyond that, I believe that is the case in looking at the statistics for usage of the online platforms of Tehran Times and Press TV. Just quite rapidly now, I'm mindful of time. I'll talk a bit about some of my work on perceptions of Israel and Jews in Iran also, and an interview study that took place in 2011 with 40 Iranian men and women who were interviewed about their attitudes. I'll just outline, the quotes are there, you can have a look at them at a later date, but I'll just outline the key themes at this point. But there was a very strong linking of anti-Zionism to Iranian national identity, to the extent where it was claimed that to be a true Iranian, you've really got to be anti-Zionist. And of course, that's linked to the version of Iranianness that's been disseminated post-revolution in 1979. There was also a positioning of Jews in relation to the in-group, and in particular Iranian Jews, the idea that they're not really Iranians at all, this sort of perception of threat, that they're the enemy within, and often pointing to Jewish faith in a way to negatively differentiate them from the in-group. There was a creation and elaboration also of anti-Semitic social representations. And you can see actually in this quote, which I will read out, you can see how that's elaborated. And that's partly why I've called my presentation The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism. The participant says many Jews died in the Holocaust. Many Muslims have also died. Many Iranians died in the imposed war. Many Muslims are being killed in Afghanistan. I don't understand the focus on Jews. So again, here, some people may reject the claim that this is anti-Semitism, but if you look closely and analytically at this discourse, there is an attenuation of the gravity of the Holocaust, which is one of the most significant acts of human destruction in history. And this is that there is a real attenuation of that, and a way of emphasizing in-group suffering versus this. I mean, the point being that this isn't really a competition, but that's exactly the way in which it's presented. Often it was presented in the interviews. And also Holocaust revisionism being a key theme throughout the discussions during the interviews. And the claim here being that if the Holocaust did take place, why is there no discussion about the Holocaust, and why is there no discussion about the underpinnings of that? Why is that silenced in the way in which it is? There are very similar themes that emerge actually in interviews that I've done with British Pakistanis, where Zionism is represented as being evil, where there is a desire to defeat the state of Israel and to do so through any means, and also to mobilize collectively as a Muslim community, to also deflect anti-Semitism and to claim that that doesn't really exist, or that one isn't really anti-Semitic, often starting a sentence with, "I got nothing against Jews, but," and then sort of the claim being made that actually could plausibly be seen as being anti-Semitic and or anti-Zionist. But I thought one of the most interesting ones, which is echoed in the data I've already presented, is the way in which anti-Semitism, and particularly anti-Zionism, can enable people to carve a space for themselves within the broader Islamic community, bearing in mind that Islam is a very diverse community. There are many denominations, and this is presented as being a common unifying cause, actually, that can unify people. And it's quite chilling, actually, to think that something like discrimination against an outgroup is something that can unify another group. It's rather unfortunate that that is seen as being something that can unify a group, although we know that that very often happens, the idea of having a common enemy. Finally, just very briefly, I wanted to mention some of the quantitative research that I've done in Iran. It was a very relatively small sample, but as you know, it's very difficult to conduct research in Iran of this kind, given that there's a great risk associated with that, especially with rather arbitrary charges that can be leveled against people for being seen to be supportive of Israel. But this study, the data was collected in 3 different areas in Tehran, and you can see the mean age of participants was relatively young. It was 27.8 years, largely a male sample. But what was quite pleasing was also to see that both political conservatives and reformists, the 2 sort of main political orientations within Iran, were included as part of the sample. As you can see here, all of the variables were measured on an 8-point scale, and these are the variables that were included. So we measured Iranian national identification, Muslim religious identification, political trust, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and identity threat as defined in identity process theory. Now you can see that the mean scores of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are pretty high, actually. And as you'd expect, Muslim religious identity is relatively high, and we know that Iran is quite a religious society. But we can see that anti-Zionism on the whole seems to be slightly higher than anti-Semitism. What we find is that identification with the nation and religion are also relatively high, but that Muslim identity is strong. And I would like you to just be aware of that with the findings that I'll present next. So we did two models to look at what predicts anti-Semitism out of the variables that we have, and we see that threat are all positively associated with them. The point being that the more you trust politics in Iran, the more likely you are to trust the messages that the Iranian regime are disseminating. And we know that anti-Semitism is one of those messages. But also, the more identified people are as Muslim, the more likely they are to be anti-Semitic, which shows in a way that you need to try and challenge this form of prejudice. We need to try and decouple that perception that to be a true Muslim or a good Muslim, you've got to be anti-Semitic, and also to try and challenge some of the anti-Semitism that occurs, particularly in relation to one's religion. So, for instance, within theological discourse or context, how Jews can be represented as being a threat. And as predicted earlier on in my presentation, threat seems to also be associated with the proclivity to discriminate. So I just wanted to now conclude by providing some reflections on what I've said. I realize it's been a whistle-stop tour of quite a lot of studies and packed into a relatively short space of time. But as I said, I'm very happy to continue conversations, and I would love to actually in this area. But what I'd like to just say to wrap up is that anti-Semitism is a global challenge, and I think it's unlike any form of prejudice. It's a form of prejudice, but it's very unique and specific. And I think other people's work, like the work of Laurette Cohen that I briefly mentioned, shows that to be the case. We know geopolitical change is also occurring. New alliances are being formed. When this research was conducted, I don't think the state of Israel had a single true friend in the region. It did have relations with Egypt and with Jordan, although they were quite volatile as well, but that's changed since. And I think that this needs to continually be monitored because of those geopolitical changes that are occurring. There's also quite massive social change that's underway that is leading some people to feel greater levels of threat. Now, you may wonder what these are. The pandemic, for instance, has had an impact on people's sense of well-being and mental health. It may also lay the foundations for a greater risk of identity threat. We know actually that intergroup prejudice has occurred during that period. We know that conspiracy theorizing has gained ground. On that note, political trust is also waning in different societies, which can, I think, open the door to anti-Semitism. Crucially, quite subtle forms of anti-Semitism are emerging as well. And we need to continually challenge those when they arise. And I would say that's most evident in, say, left-wing anti-Semitism that we sometimes talk about, in the UK at least, where we may not see the kind of caliber of anti-Semitism or the level of anti-Semitism that we see that I've described here. Nevertheless, similar social representations may be subtly invoked. And that we need to be very well aware of and cognizant of. The questions I think this gives rise to is, how can we support people to manage feelings of threat when they feel threatened? How do we do so in a way that promotes more positive coping strategies rather than prejudice as a knee-jerk response? How do we stop people from denigrating others and call them out when that actually happens? Just as one point of clarification, there can be trepidation sometimes about engaging with Muslim anti-Semitism because some people may be afraid of being seen as being Islamophobic, and I think that it's really important that we do not allow any group or any individual from any group to perpetrate prejudice against another group out of fear of offending them. And I think we need to really engage with this. And we need to also expose and challenge political uses of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, continually exert pressure on societies where this remains commonplace. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm sorry for going over time. I greatly look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Rusi, that was fascinating. It was this excellent talk. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, please click on the reactions emoji, if you will, on the bottom of the screen and raise your hands. Somebody has their hand up, trying to see who that is.
Gary.
Okay, Carrie, go ahead.
Hi. I must say that I began to formulate my question within minutes of your starting. It was an extremely elegant talk and also very challenging for me because in a way it asks me to upend my whole way of thinking about the problem. I do at least theoretically welcome such challenges. By that, I mean, if you start with the fine definition of anti-Semitism as a latent structure, in the areas in which I work, which are mostly within academia, best practice is to set that aside. And my watchword always is, I don't know what's in someone's heart. I can't find out what's in someone's heart. I have to concern myself with what they say and do, not with motivations, not with a sort of psychological underpinning, but with the surface of actions. And certainly from the Nazis to Iran, anti-Semitism is often a very overt set of theories, manifestly, a very overt set of political claims, not primarily a latent structure. So what my question is this, sorry for that preamble, has this led you to try to go further in theorizing the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious, between motivation and the sort of surface dramatic manifestations of anti-Semitism? Because you've challenged me to take into consideration what I usually set aside as ineffable, but I'm not sure how to think about the relationship between the two yet.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Carrie. I think that from my perspective, because we live in a society, particularly in the UK, where overt forms of prejudice are really quite stigmatized, we often see people that it remaining very latent and not really manifested at all, but it's there. It's there. I think it's there. It's within the individual. It's existed within the individual because of exposure to, say, social representations. And it can emerge when contextual factors allow it to emerge, but perhaps where that becomes socially acceptable, as is the case with, say, anti-Zionism, which is very socially acceptable. So my work's really about trying to understand the sources of these ideas that can become part of an individual's thinking, though not necessarily manifested at any given point in time, and to look at what those factors are that can really increase the risk of it being manifested. And I guess that's the reason why I've decided to look at it from the perspective that I have looked at it. I think there's a real risk if we don't examine that it remains in people's way of thinking, and it very subtly shapes the way in which they engage with others. And as we know, that can have a tremendously negative impact on the well-being of Jews, for instance, on university campuses, where they are constantly exposed to quite subtle forms of prejudice, and in other contexts as well. So yeah, but I think it's an area that definitely needs a lot more thought, and hopefully with colleagues, we'll get to the bottom of this.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Lisa Burke.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for providing both the presentation and this format for engaging in discussion. I have an observation that I hope in essence is a question. One of the things that strikes me is that so often here in the US, recognizing that the Holocaust and anti-Semitism are under-discussed, you know, in social discourse and even in some elimination of bias contexts. One thing that strikes me from this presentation is really putting, kind of contrasting the notion of the Holocaust as a particular incident at a moment in time that we have the residuals from, and really looking at this broader framework of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So I wondered if you might comment further, if when we're thinking about like diversity, inclusion initiatives, elimination of structural bias, I'm struck by your comment about latency and subtlety. Could you talk a little bit more about how you think that geopolitical dynamics work to support these divisive and biased frameworks in society, and why latency and subtleness seem to be so key to those efforts? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. I think, again, just sort of building on the response that I gave to the previous question, I think because there is a great deal of stigma, societal stigma against overt forms of prejudice, including Holocaust denial, there are, I think, as a result of various geopolitical events that have occurred, there is, I think, a proclivity now to more subtly challenge the veracity of the Holocaust, or at the very least to challenge its implications or its gravity. So this isn't necessarily the denial of the Holocaust itself. I think some people are still able to claim that they believe the Holocaust happened, but just not in the way in which it's commonly thought to have happened. And I think that form of Holocaust we might call revisionism is less stigmatized in some circles. It's presented as being, the social representation of it is it's sort of scientific inquiry, legitimate scholarly inquiry, and therefore needs to proceed. And actually simultaneously what that does is it increases, I think, the level or the perception of threat that I've talked about, that some people, particularly some young Muslims may have, where they believe that not only the world is being controlled by Jews, but also that the dominant narratives about anything are being controlled by Jews. And this is but one example. So that I think shows why it's just so important for us to continue to look at more subtle forms of this, rather than just the sort of classic Holocaust denial, the denial that it actually ever happened.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Any other questions or comments? Rusi, I wondered how you were able to obtain these Iranian participants. Was that online, or what was how did you do that?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, it wasn't online. This was in the days before we sort of learned how to do Zoom and Microsoft Teams, actually. No, it was actually done in Iran. A research assistant collected the data in Iran at great personal risk, but was just very keen to understand this phenomenon further and had access to samples. So I didn't personally do the interviews myself. It was the research assistant. It was very difficult actually to do that research because of the way in which this type of activity could be interpreted. The way in which it was approached, however, was as part of a broader study looking at intergroup attitudes within Iran, and it included a variety of groups, so attitudes towards the Baha'i community in Iran, as well as attitudes towards Afghans, who are a highly stigmatized minority within Iran. So that was the way in which it was presented. And actually during the course of the interviews, Israel invariably emerged. There were semi-structured interviews that were conducted, but it just shows that when discussing Jews and Judaism in Iran, Israel does emerge as being a key topic as well, but often sort of through the lens of threat. And an example of that, which I didn't present as part of this presentation, is around the links that Jews within Iran may have with the state of Israel, and therefore that they may be conspiring against the Islamic Republic of Iran. So yes, it was challenging, but again, it feels that study feels very important to me, because I know it wouldn't be very easy to conduct these days.
Yeah. Thank you. Ira?
Thank you for your presentation. Had you noticed any qualitative features of the within group variation? In other words, I'd read certain testimonies that many Muslims see the government as using Israel as a scapegoat to cover up for internal domestic problems. And they don't really buy it, but they're afraid to say it. Because as you know, they undergo a lot of scrutiny. Dare they not agree with the political themes?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a great question. And actually, I haven't done very much in this area over the last couple of years, but I'll give you an example of something that was very observable from the interviews that were conducted. So you'll recall that I mentioned that we had reformists and political conservatives or hardliners within the sample. The reformists were part of the sort of the Green movement in Iran, and were deeply opposed to the policies of then President Ahmadinejad, who was probably one of the more anti-Zionist presidents that Iran's seen in recent years. And I think they saw anti-Semitism as traditionally defined as being a bit ridiculous and as being something that was being sort of forwarded by Muslim hardliners. And indeed, many of them rejected Islam as well because they saw that as being kind of imposed upon them. Yet, in the interviews themselves with reformists, you could see that they, whilst claiming to oppose anti-Semitism, were reproducing many of the anti-Semitic tropes themselves. And the way I interpreted that is, when you've been exposed to systematic anti-Semitic discourse from a school age constantly, it sort of becomes part of your way of thinking. So it seemed quite promising that they at least acknowledged that anti-Semitism was wrong, but it was so part of their cognition essentially that they were often reproducing that themselves when sort of manifesting anti-Zionism, which they conversely did see as being legitimate, so basically opposition to the state of Israel. So it was very, very complex, I think, even at that time. But I can see, I would hypothesize that now, given the realization that many Iranian citizens have reached about the government and the current regime, many see the idea of Israel as being an enemy as being slightly ridiculous, and as you know, that domestic issues really need to be addressed first and foremost, rather than the sort of constructed enemy that's existed for many decades.
Thank you.
I'll ask another question, seeing no other hands up. This research that you've engaged in is very fascinating to me for a variety of reasons. One is that I'm studying the breadth of online anti-Semitism, and so I don't know if there's an answer to this, if anyone could really answer this, but I'm going to go for it anyway. We see the enormity of misinformation about Israel, about Jews online, and the breadth and the depth of anti-Semitism online, again, is enormous. I know that there are sort of younger social media influencers who are trying to combat this. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are around combating online anti-Semitism, and if it's even a realistic enterprise.
So I think we need to continue to challenge anti-Semitism in all of its forms, and actually we need a lot of support from social media platforms as well to recognize and to call out anti-Semitism where it exists, so that users, for instance, can be removed and so on. But I think there'll always be limits as to what can be done in social media spaces, because there is people often have anonymity as well, which enables them to say things and to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. But what concerns me is the impact, something I haven't really talked about in my presentation, but I think we should all be mindful of, the impact of being a member of a group that's stigmatized. And in some contexts, being Jewish is stigmatized for a variety of reasons, but not just being a member of a stigmatized group, also being exposed to prejudice, and that prejudice not being recognized by others and therefore not being dealt with. All of these things, as a psychologist, I know can really radically impact on a person's mental health. So we've got to be really aware of that. And therefore, I think there needs to be recognition of the problem of anti-Semitism, and greater action by social media platforms to try and challenge this. In terms of influencers, I actually think they have a really fundamental role to play. Much as I'd like to have a large Twitter following, the reality is young people don't listen to what I've got to say. They listen to what influencers have got to say. And therefore, if we can actually work together, to try and address some of these issues and be quite dynamic and use things like TikTok to also address this, and not just for this to be within the academic domain, I think we'll make a great deal of progress on this front.
Thank you. Somebody wrote a question in the chat. David Maudlin, why is denial in relation to truth a problem? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Maybe you do. Oh, to me. He wrote that to me. I don't know the context of that question. So David, if you'd like to unmute yourself, feel free to do so.
Looks like he's left building.
He's left the building. Okay.
Well, we'll never know. We'll never know.
Could just hypothesize, as we do, right? Okay. Any other questions or comments for Dr. Jaspal? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Jaspal. Really fascinating and, as Carrie said, elegant presentation. I think that's the perfect word. Really appreciate you being with us today and providing this really interesting information and food for thought. Cheryl Keir's clapping. I clap as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julie, and many, many thanks to everyone who's attended. It's been a very enjoyable hour talking to you and thinking further about this. So look forward to engaging further in the future. All the very best to you.
Okay, you as well. Bye now. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.